What if I told you that the Chinese GP classification hid something much bigger than a simple great lap by Lewis Hamilton? Because while everyone was looking at the time that the Briton had just set with Ferrari, inside the paddock, they began to talk about something else much more disturbing. The FIA had revealed details about the tests that Hamilton carried out with the car before this weekend, and what they found left even Charles Leclerc completely shocked. Nobody expected the 7-time world champion to reach this level of adaptation so quickly, much less that he could surpass Leclerc precisely in the area where the Monégasque has always been strongest, qualifying. But when they began to analyze the telemetry and what really happened during those previous test sessions came to light, many within Ferrari understood that this had not been a coincidence. Hamilton had discovered something in the car, something that is now changing the balance within the team. And the big question is, what exactly did the FIA see in those tests, and why did it leave Leclerc so surprised after qualifying in China? Subscribe to continue uploading more of this type of content now, if we continue. And it is precisely at that point where the situation begins to take on a much more delicate dimension within Ferrari, because when a qualifying session ends and they begin to analyze in depth what had happened on the track, an element appears that completely changes the conversation. The references to the tests that Hamilton had carried out with the car before arriving in China, and the information that the FIA had about those sessions. What initially seems simply part of the normal process of a driver adapting to a new team begins to be seen from another angle when some details begin to come to light within the paddock. Because those tests were not simple shoots to accumulate kilometers. According to what emerges from the technical analysis and the context surrounding those sessions, Hamilton used those days to explore something very specific, the real limits of the Ferrari's behavior in qualifying conditions, something that many drivers normally discover over several races, but that he was trying to decipher before the season even began in earnest. The FIA, as part of its normal supervision over the testing and development of cars, constantly reviews the data that the teams generate in these types of sessions. And in this specific case, what began to be commented on in the technical environment of the championship is that the work carried out by Hamilton during those tests had been much deeper than it appeared publicly. The Brit wasn't simply adapting to the car, was testing different extreme configurations of aerodynamic balance, especially in the relationship between the front axle and rear stability, something that in modern single-seaters can radically change the way a driver attacks a fast lap. This type of exploration is risky because it often forces the car to move close to its stability limit, but it can also reveal windows of performance that other drivers have not yet discovered. And when Ferrari began to compare Friday's telemetry with what had been worked on in those tests, a very clear coincidence appeared. The way Hamilton was taking certain corners in Shanghai, especially in areas where traction and car rotation are critical, fit perfectly with some of the experimental setups he had been testing previously. That meant I wasn't improvising over the weekend. I was executing something I had already understood before. For any driver, arriving at a track with that technical confidence completely changes the way you approach qualifying. You don't need to look for the limit. You already know approximately where it is. For Leclerc, that discovery was particularly uncomfortable, because the Monégasque had spent years developing his own understanding of the Ferrari, building his driving style around the car's specific characteristics. He was the one who usually led the way for the team when it came to finding the perfect lap. But in China, as he reviewed the data, he began to see something he wasn't expecting. Hamilton was using the car in a slightly different way, exploiting a more aggressive balance in certain phases of the corner that, until then, Ferrari had not considered the most consistent option for a full race weekend. That explains why, when the session ended and conversations began inside the box, Leclerc's reaction was not simply the normal frustration of a driver who has fallen behind his teammate. It was more of a mix of surprise and analysis. Because when you see someone find speed on your own turf, the first thing you try to understand is where exactly that advantage comes from. And in this case, all the clues led to that previous work, to those tests that Hamilton had used to prepare the ground before the championship really got underway. At that moment, a very interesting feeling began to take hold within Ferrari. On the one hand, the team was optimistic that their new signing was finding real performance so early in the season. But on the other hand, they also understood that this could alter the internal balance much sooner than expected. Because if Hamilton had already discovered a way to extract more performance from a car in qualifying, that meant that the internal battle within the team was just beginning. And what happened in China could be just the first sign of something much bigger that was about to unfold inside the Ferrari garage. And this is where the whole story ends up coming together, because after qualifying for the Chinese Grand Prix, within Ferrari there was no longer talk simply of a good lap by Lewis Hamilton, but of something that could completely change the competitive balance of the team for the rest of the season. When the engineers finished reviewing the data, the conclusion began to become quite clear. Hamilton had not just found a few circumstantial tenths, he had discovered a different way of making the car work. And that is something that in Formula One has enormous value, because when a driver manages to unlock a performance window that others are not using, the impact does not remain only in a qualifying session, but can influence the entire development of the car during the year. For Ferrari, this represented a fascinating and at the same time delicate scenario. For the first time since his arrival, Hamilton did not look like a driver who was still learning how to adapt to the Ferrari, but rather someone who was beginning to mold the car in his own way. That is exactly the point at which a driver of his caliber becomes truly dangerous within a team. Because when Hamilton finds confidence in the car, he not only improves his personal performance, he also begins to influence technical decisions, the direction of development, and the way in which the team interprets the car's behavior. And that means Ferrari could be entering a whole new phase of its project. For Charles Leclerc, this opened up a very different challenge than the one he had had until now within the team. For years, it had been the natural reference point, the pilot around which much of the understanding of the car was built. But now he had a teammate in front of him who not only brought experience, but also a different way of understanding the limits of the car. What happened in China was the first clear evidence that this internal battle could be much more intense than many imagined at the beginning of the season. Because if Hamilton had already achieved this level of performance in just his second Grand Prix with Ferrari, the question that began to circulate within the paddock was inevitable. What will happen when the Briton completely understands the car? And that's where everything that happened during those previous tests makes sense again. What the FIA had observed was not simply a driver adapting to a new team, but a much more methodical process. Hamilton was building the foundations of his performance before the decisive weekends even began. China was simply the first moment in which that work became visible to everyone. The qualifying lap was not a sudden stroke of inspiration, but the result of weeks of technical exploration, balance adjustments, and obsessive search for the exact point where the Ferrari could offer its maximum performance. That's why Leclerc's reaction was so revealing. It wasn't just about losing to his teammate in a specific session, but about understanding that that teammate had arrived prepared for something bigger. The Chinese GP classification made it clear that within Ferrari there is no longer as predictable a hierarchy as before. Hamilton has shown that he can find real speed in the car, and that he is willing to push the team in a new direction if it allows him to fight at the top again. And if what we saw in Shanghai was just the beginning, then the real story inside Ferrari is just beginning. And in the end, what happened in qualifying for the Chinese Grand Prix was much more than just a surprise on the timesheets. It was the first moment in which all the silent work that Lewis Hamilton had done for weeks began to become visible to everyone inside the paddock. The previous tests, the hours in the simulator, the changes in his way of working with Ferrari, and that obsessive search to understand the car's limits ended up being reflected in a lap that was not only fast, but also revealed something much more important. Hamilton had begun to find his place within the car. For Ferrari, this opens up a completely new scenario. For years, the team had built its presence around Charles Leclerc, a driver who knows perfectly the DNA of the car and who has been the natural reference in classification. But what was seen in Shanghai shows that internal dynamics could be changing sooner than many imagined. Hamilton is not here to adapt slowly. It has arrived with the clear intention of competing from the first moment, of pushing the car to new areas of performance, and of once again placing itself at the center of the competitive fight. For Leclerc, this means the season could turn into one of the most intense internal battles Ferrari has had in recent years. Because now you know that your partner not only has the experience and talent that everyone knows, but also an extremely methodical work process that is already starting to give results. What happened in China was a silent warning that Hamilton is finding real speed in the car, and that the fight within the team is just beginning. And that is precisely the big question that remains open after this weekend. If Hamilton has already been able to surprise everyone, including Leclerc, in just his second Grand Prix with Ferrari, what will happen when the Briton fully understands the potential of the car? Because if the history of Formula One has shown anything, it is that when a driver of this caliber begins to feel really comfortable with his car, the impact can completely change the course of a season. Subscribe to continue uploading more of that content. Now you really think about all this.